Today what I'm going to talk about is some general ideas about human rights. And of course, the starting point is that human rights are a body of principles governing relations between the state and the individual. They set out our rights as citizens and set limits on state power. So human rights include things like freedom of speech, the right to protest, freedom of religion or non-religion, and so on and so on. And these are all basic principles which say that no government, no matter what its mandate, has the right to infringe these fundamental freedoms. That there can be no justification for inhibiting your right to say what you think, to protest against things you find objectionable, and so on. These principles are not God-given, they're not handed down in tablets, they're the result of a dialogue, a conversation, a consultation between governments, citizens, and organisations. They've evolved over centuries, and what it means is that we have, as a common humanity, through reason, ethics, debate and conversation, encapsulated a set of values that we believe should be binding on everyone in this country and in every country. So the principle is not just of local or national rights, but of universal human rights. Now, of course, we see often that human rights are under attack. So when Islamist extremists like Abu Hamza or Abu Qatada did terrible things, there were many people who said, lock him up and throw away the key. But that's not the way we do things in a democracy where we respect human rights. Of course, if bad people do bad things, they should be punished, but according to the law. Everyone should be subject to the rule of law, from the highest person in government to even the most objectionable private citizen. So, when there were attempts to, for example, impose indefinite detention on terrorist suspects, many of us said, no, that is not right. If there is evidence, charge, prosecute, convict, and sentence these persons. But if it's just because they hold objectionable views, unless they're inciting violence or terrorism, they should be allowed to express those views, and we should be allowed to protest against them. So, of course, when it comes to human rights, what I'm trying to say is that there are no exceptions. Human rights apply to everyone. You've got the right to insult me, to insult the Queen, to insult the Prime Minister. You've got a right to mock and satirise political ideas, religious beliefs, and so on and so on and so on. What you haven't got the right to do is to make false, damaging allegations against someone. So, if someone said that, I don't know, that Boris Johnson was a paedophile, that would be A, would be factually inaccurate, but B, would be a damaging defamation. No one should have a right to abuse free speech to say things like that. Equally, no one should have the right to menace, threaten, harass another person. So you may have heard of the woman who was campaigning to get a woman on the new £5 note. And she was subject to a torrent of sexist, misogynistic, hate mail and threats. Not just disagreeable comments, but really hateful, insightful things. And that amounted to harassment, and that was clearly wrong. And the other big third no-no is, of course, incitements to violence. So some of you may know that about 15 years ago, a group of Jamaican reggae artists like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Vybz Kartel and so on, put out tracts inciting the murder of LGBT people. They didn't merely say that homosexuality is wrong, they said that gay people should be shot, hanged, burned and drowned. And that clearly is tantamount to incitement to murder. So those are the three red lines where freedom of speech does have its limits. But as I said, overall, human rights are universal, and they apply even to people who say very disagreeable and very offensive things. The only exception that is granted in human rights law is that in certain exceptional circumstances, when it comes to the threat of terrorism or threats to public health, then governments do have the right to restrict human rights for an appropriate, proportionate time. So, for example, when Ebola broke out in West Africa, governments took extreme measures to quarantine and isolate people who'd been in suspected contact with the Ebola virus. And they didn't have freedom of movement. They were constrained. They were in some cases actually detained against their will. But that was, I think, legitimate in order to prevent a wider epidemic. And likewise with bird flu in China. You know, the Chinese government isolated villagers and particular individuals who'd been in contact with infected birds, and that did restrict their human rights and their freedom, but it was necessary and proportionate in order to protect the wider population. And as soon as the threat subsided, then those restrictions were removed. When we think of human rights, we often think of a very modern concept of human rights. But actually, if you go back in history, the antecedents or roots of human rights go back not centuries, but millennia. So, let's look at the beginnings of human rights. In the first earliest human civilizations, rights were conceived as only applying to the immediate family. You and your family had rights, but no other families did. And then gradually, as families coalesced into tribes and clans, the sense of rights was extended beyond the family to the whole extended family, the clan, the tribe. And then with the evolution of nations, those rights were extended to whole groups of people within that nation, but usually not to people from other nations. So in ancient times, when one nation conquered another, they mass murdered the conquered civilian populations. They mass raped the conquered women of those civilizations. And it's only quite recently, really in the last 100 years, that the principle or idea of universal human rights came into existence. The idea that everyone on this planet, no matter what country, culture, faith or political system under which they live, that every single person has equal human rights. Now, of course, the modern concepts, as I said, are fairly recent, about 100 years or so. But if you go back in history, you can see embryonic ideas of human rights much, much earlier. So go back to ancient India. Ancient India in the 2nd century BC. The warlord Ashoka had a Damascene conversion. He went from being a bloodthirsty tyrant to embrace Buddhism and set out a set of principles in the Ashoka edicts which sought to protect the poor and the vulnerable. This had never been codified or presented previously in any coherent way by previous rulers in India. Even earlier than that, in the 5th century BC, in ancient Persia, Cyrus the Great wrote down on the Cyrus cylinder a set of basic principles about freeing the slaves, recognizing and protecting diverse religions, and equality between people of different races and ethnicities. This is in the 5th century BC. Of course, they didn't embrace the full gamut of the human rights that we know, but these were the beginnings. Here in this country, I guess the first really important moment was the Magna Carta in 1215, which set out limits on the power of the king, who previously had absolute power over the rest of the citizenry, and also established basic principles for the rule of law. So, opposing arbitrary detention, setting up the principle that people, if they were being arrested, they had to be charged and tried within a reasonable space of time. that neither the king, the barons, or anybody else could simply arrest people, throw them in jail, and leave them there. But I suppose really, moving on a bit, the late 1700s was, if you like, the real beginnings of the human rights ideas, with the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then later, in 1787, the promulgation of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. These set out the idea that all men are created free and equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, the ideal was there, but as you know, it only applied to white Americans. These edicts, this declaration, this constitution was set out at a time when slavery still existed in large parts of the United States. So although it talked about universal principles, in reality, the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights were only applied for 2 centuries to white Americans, not to African Americans. In 1789, we had the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Citizen in France. The principles of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Again, the principle was that all people are born free and equal, that people are innocent until proven guilty by a court of law. These were very important, also very important aspects of human rights in the late 17th century, late 18th century, in the late 1700s. Then, of course, we move on a bit in history, and we see that the first truly comprehensive universal statement of human rights was, of course, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, promulgated in 1948. It was a reaction to the horrors of Nazism. It was a sense that these terrible things were done. We must establish a universal set of principles that apply to all governments and all peoples in all nations, to say that these are the red lines which no government should be allowed to cross. These are the red lines that protect every citizen against excessive, arbitrary state power. And that Universal Declaration of Human Rights is often misunderstood as a Western idea, a Western concept. But in reality, the authors came from all different continents and cultures. You know, the Egyptians and the Indians were just as important as the Americans and the British in writing the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was the start, 1948. And then since then, those principles have been further developed and expanded with subsequent specialist human rights conventions. So, for example, in 1948, the UN agreed the Genocide Convention, outlawing genocide, the targeting of ethnic, racial and other groups for extermination. That became illegal explicitly in 1948. The following year was the Geneva Conventions against War Crimes, which set out the rules of war. That, for example, it is not permissible to indiscriminately bomb civilian populations or areas where there are large or even small civilian populations. So, for example, the United States mass carpet bombing of Cambodia in the 1970s was quite clearly a war crime under the Geneva Conventions of 1949 because that bombing was indiscriminate. It carpet bombed whole regions of Cambodia where hundreds of thousands of civilians lived. Then moving on a bit, in 1984 we had the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which explicitly outlawed torture by member states of the United Nations to prevent torture and other cruel, degrading, ill treatment. Then we had a view that these rights are important. These rights, like liberty, they're very important, but surely there are also economic and cultural human rights. So, in 1966, there was an elaboration of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in what is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It went into more detail about political and civil rights freedoms, expanding what was written in the Universal Declaration. And in the same year, there was passed the United Nations Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which specifically said that human rights are not just about freedom of speech and the right to protest or the right to strike. They're also about the economic basics of life, that these too are human rights: the right to food, clean water, shelter, education and healthcare, that these too are human rights. So up to that point, human rights have been very narrowly defined in terms of liberties and freedoms. This convention extended it into the economic and cultural realm as well. In Europe, in 1950, there was the European Convention on Human Rights drawn up and agreed. Again, very much a reaction to the horrors of the Second World War, and an attempt to bring all the European nations together, both those who were victorious and those who were defeated, to bring them together in a common consensus about rights and freedoms for all the peoples of Europe. Of course, all these different human rights conventions were of their time. So when you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the European Convention on Human Rights, you will see that there's nothing explicit there that outlaws discrimination against disabled people, because the rights of disabled people were not understood and not accepted and not recognised way back then. Also, there's nothing in that convention to protect the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people. Those were rights that were not recognised. But thankfully what's happened in the intervening years is gradually these rights have been accepted and interpreted to be part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. Not by all countries by a long shot, but by many. So for example, in the late 1990s, on LGBT people in the armed forces in Britain was unlawful, unjust discrimination. And as a consequence, the then Labour government of Tony Blair ended that ban. Going on a bit further, as you know, in 1998, Britain legislated the Human Rights Act, which incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights into British law. So we now have direct redress through the Human Rights Act if our rights and freedoms have been violated. And this has, for example, been used on many, many occasions to assert citizens' rights against the government. There have been a lot of rulings under the Human Rights Act which have found the government to be acting unlawfully by doing X, Y and Z. So again, that's a very important safeguard, and it means that people don't have to go to the European Court of Human Rights. Whereas before they always had to go to the European Court of Human Rights, but now they can get redress via the Human Rights Act of 1998. I guess my final point is that the human rights conventions are there, and I've listed quite a few of them. The principles are very, very good. The problem is in interpretation and enforcement. There are these wonderful documents espousing great universal principles, but at the end of the day, often they are not implemented. So I'm sure you're all aware of the horrors that have been going on in Syria in recent years. We have had the mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas by the Assad regime and its Russian allies. These are clearly war crimes under the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which prohibit the indiscriminate bombing of civilian populated areas. Likewise, you've probably seen or heard about the Caesar report about mass torture and executions in Syrian prisons. Again, just to take the torture dimension alone, quite clearly those mass tortures are a violation of the United Nations Convention Against Torture 1984. The violations are staring us in the face. Yet, as you know, nothing has been done. Nothing has been done. Assad, the Russians, Hezbollah and Iran have been able to get away with mass human rights violations in Syria, as of course has ISIS and some of the other Islamist extremist groups. So this does beg the question, what is the purpose of having international human rights law if we don't have a means to enforce it? If countries are able to violate the principles that they've signed up, and if they can do so with impunity, without any kind of redress or action being taken against them. Some of you may recall or may have heard that I have twice attempted a citizen's arrest of President Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe over human rights abuses. This for me was a last resort. President Mugabe had been authorizing violent mobs to attack democratic and human rights defenders in Zimbabwe. He had authorized torture. He had given a green light to vigilante mobs who were going and killing people left, right and centre. And again, even though this was a clear violation of international human rights law, no one was doing anything. In fact, I discovered to my shock that President Mugabe was touring around European capitals on shopping trips and other visits with total impunity. Even though all the countries he was visiting had signed the Convention Against Torture and other human rights conventions which he was clearly violating. I thought to myself, why aren't they arresting him and putting him on trial? We know the courts in Zimbabwe can't do anything because, of course, they are often nobbled with pro-Mugabe appointees. So I hit on the idea, at the request of Zimbabwean human rights defenders, I hit on the idea of using the power of citizen's arrest. Under British law and the law of most countries, any private citizen has the right to arrest another person if they have evidence that they have committed a crime or they're about to commit a crime. So, acting legally, I devised this plot to try and do a citizen's arrest on President Mugabe. I did it twice. The first one was in London in 1999. I got a late night tip-off, an anonymous phone call, that President Mugabe had arrived in London for a private shopping trip to Harrods. And he was staying at St James's Court Hotel in Victoria. Before I could say anything, the caller hung up. So I decided to assume the caller might be right. So I phoned around lots of human rights organisations to ask them to help me go to the St James's Court Hotel and try and arrest Mugabe on charges of torture. Because I had evidence that he had authorised the torture of two black journalists in Zimbabwe, Ray Choto and Mark Chavanduka, who worked for the Standard newspaper. He had authorised and approved their torture. So there was clear evidence that he was guilty under the United Nations Convention Against Torture, 1984, and under the 1998 Crime and Policing Bill, which incorporates that convention into British law. So, I've never heard so many excuses in all my life. But everybody had a good excuse. Oh, I'm going away for the weekend, I'm busy with work, I'm feeling ill. So in the end, I turned to my colleagues in the LGBT Direct Action Group Outrage. I asked them, I said, this is not an LGBT issue. You know, Mugabe is homophobic. This is about torture. This is about arresting him for torture. And out of 200 or 300 people in outrage at the time, eventually 3 others agreed that they would come and help me. So we turned up outside Mugabe's hotel early on a Saturday morning. We knew we'd have to leave the hotel at some point. We didn't know what time, so we thought we'd get there really early and we'll try and arrest him, either as he comes out down the steps of the hotel to get in his limousine, or if he drives out through the vehicle entrance. So we lay in wait outside the hotel, trying to look inconspicuous. You know, one guy stood at a bus stop reading a newspaper, another one went in a telephone booth and pretended to make phone calls. I was looking in shop windows, and others did other things. And plus we brought with us a photographer, a journalist and a video person. Because the idea was to get all this recorded, because we knew that if we got caught, we might face very serious criminal charges. And also we wanted to show that we had acted lawfully. So we were laying in wait, and the time ticked away, hours passed. We arrived at 8:30, by 10 o'clock he hadn't shown. I was dying to go for a pee, because when you're doing these kind of protests, you get very, very nervous, so you have the urge to urinate, you know. And I knew if I went up and tried to find a toilet, that was probably the moment he kind of came out. So what I did, I had a copy of the Evening Standard in my bag, I rolled it into a cone, and then stood in the shop doorway and peed into it, and then put it in the rubbish bin. Emergency requires emergency action. Anyway, at about just after 10 o'clock, we noticed that the concierge of the hotel, this is the guy with the top hat and tails who greets new guests, he stood on the steps and started looking at each of us. And quite clearly he noticed we'd been there for a while and was presumably wondering who we are. And I began to get even more nervous because I thought, well, if he thinks we're a threat, if he thinks we might be suspicious, he'll call the police and our plan will fall to pieces. The next thing I know, about 10 minutes later or so, out from the side entrance of the hotel, where the vehicles come out, about 5 or 6 African-looking guys appeared and started looking and pointing our direction. I thought to myself, I bet they're Mugabe security. So up to this point, I had no indication that he was actually in the hotel. It was just I was acting on the basis of an anonymous phone call. But I thought, this is the first time I thought, he is probably in the hotel and that's probably his bodyguard. Again I thought, if they're suspicious, he won't come out, or even more likely, they will call the police. And the whole plan will go down the Swanee. So, it's really hard to think on your feet when you're so nervous. I was shaking, I was freezing cold, I was so nervous. I had a splitting headache and a nervous tension. But then what I decided to do, I walked across the road, straight over to these African guys, smiling and beaming, and held out my hand to shake their hand. I said, "Hi guys, I'm from the News of the World, and these are my fellow journalists and photographer and video person. We've got a tip-off that Elton John is in the hotel with his new boyfriend. We've got to get the story for tomorrow's paper. Can you tell us what room he's in?" They looked at me like I was mad. I said, "Look, I know you guys at Elton John Security. You wouldn't be here if he wasn't in the hotel. We've got to get this exclusive story and photographs for tomorrow's News of the World. Please, can you help us?" Anyway, they started laughing, but wouldn't give anything away. So I said, "Look, I'll give you £50 if you tell us what room he's in." They shook their head. "I'll give you £75. I'll give you £100. I only had £10 in my pocket. Anyway, that didn't convince them. So then I turned to one of them and said, "You can't fool me. I know you. You were at Elton's concert at Wembley Arena 2 months ago." There hadn't been a concert 2 months ago. Anyway, I said, "You were at his concert 2 months ago. I saw you there. If Elton John wasn't here, you wouldn't be here. We know he's in the hotel. We know he's got this new boyfriend. We've got to get the photos." And then they started speaking in African dialect, Nebadili or Shona. And they all burst out laughing. Then they just walked away. I walked back to my colleagues. I thought, I think I might have convinced them. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, out from the vehicle entrance came President Mugabe in his limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate it was him in the car, and my 3 outraged colleagues further up the street ran straight out in front of his speeding limousine. It stopped about 6 inches from their legs, screeched to a halt. Then one ran behind the car, so it couldn't move forward and couldn't move backward. I ran from the side and opened the back rear door, the left-hand rear door. Amazingly, it was unlocked, and there before me was the President of Zimbabwe. You should have seen the look on his face. He shrunk back in his seat, he put up his hands, his eyes popped, his jaw dropped. He looked like a frightened 10-year-old kid. I thought to myself, now you know how your victims feel, only I'm not going to kill you. I'm going to take you to court of law and you'll have a chance to defend yourself. So I said to him, President Mugabe, you are under arrest on charges of torture. Torture is a crime under international law. I am now summoning the police. He had a bodyguard in the back with him, but he was cowering in the corner like this. I was fearful he might have a gun and shoot, and I was ready, just to drop to the ground or duck behind the car. But no. So we held him there. The police came. We explained who was in the car, and they said, "Who? The President of Zimbabwe?" And we said, "Here's the evidence. Here's the documentary evidence that he has authorised torture, which is contrary to Section 134 of the Criminal Justice Act, 1988. They weren't interested. They didn't give a damn. We were arrested, and President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. We faced a whole huge list of charges. Criminal damage, obstructing the highway, assaulting the police, riot in the fray. It was all completely fabricated. So we were bailed eventually to appear at court, and when we did, we made it clear that we had a video person, a camera person, and an independent journalist who would testify that 15 police officers were committing perjury. Amazingly, all the charges were dropped. We were free to go. The upshot was that, of course, I did not succeed in arresting President Mugabe, but it did signal to him that the world was watching, because the media publicity went viral all around the world, in papers all over the world, and the message that I got back from people in Zimbabwe were very similar. They said, well, you tried but didn't succeed, but at least you tried. And a lot of people said, you gave us hope that people cared about what's happening. We thought we were forgotten, we thought no one cared. The fact that you did this or tried this gave us emotional and psychological support. So sadly, President Mugabe is still there, but he too will one day have his fall. No tyranny lasts forever. Remember, Adolf Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted all of 12 years. So remember that when you see tyranny, recognize that it will have its fall, but only if you and people like you challenge it and oppose it. Thank you.